How's life? I'm glad you could join me today for a 30-minute mobility practice. So, just going to get settled in on your mat, and we're going to start in a kneeling position today. Personally, I find the kneeling position to be amazing for helping me mobilize my ankles and my knees and just make sure that those two key areas are well taken care of. So, this first variation here is a rotational reach. Rotate through the head and shoulders, plant the hand and reach across the body and really extend into that reach. The more that you work to reach for your end range of motion, the more stretch that you'll create in your body. And of course, we're remembering to breathe while going through these movements. The mindset I talk about in a practice like this especially is to just stay curious and observe the body. Observe what emerges as you go into these different positions and go into these different patterns. We'll go into a flexed foot kneel next, rocking back and forth, mobilizing the toes, opening up the bottoms of the feet, and even getting some spinal mobilization as well. Because of our movement habits and our lifestyle habits, I see many people struggle with the act of kneeling on the ground or balancing on the balls of the feet, articulating the feet. This rocking action is just a really gentle way to start to promote more movement, to gently develop more range of motion. We'll combine the rotational reach with the tucked toes, and this will intensify the stretch. Continue your breathing. I like an exhale as I reach. And just take the time to observe your body. Observe the stretches that emerge and observe any differences that occur between the right and left sides. Now that the feet are primed, we can move on to a transition from kneeling into a deep squat or deep knee bend. This transition shows up in my practices pretty often. In this case, we're focusing on slowing things down and finding the stretch here, flexing the spine, reaching forward before I open back up and gently bring the knees down, plant the hands back, and start to extend. We've got flexion of the spine, using the breath here to create length, create space in the body, inhaling up, stabilizing, and leaning back, timing that movement right so the knees touch the ground softly. Post the hands back behind the body and then opening up into extension. There's no performance goals here. This is just movement that's meant to be savored. So enjoy your time in each position. Breathe and observe the feedback that your body sends you. Next, we're moving from a kneel to a split kneel. I love this position because it gives such a good stretch for the hip flexor on that back leg. We're also going to incorporate a transition into a half kneeling step out. The back leg is going to step forward, position out in front of us, and allow the weight to glide forward and sink into the front hip. We've seen this pattern many times in other practice videos, and we're just going to go back and forth between the split kneel and the half kneel. So as you can start to see through the first few minutes of this practice, we're going to be working a lot of different transitions. It's not just going to be holding passive stretches, but we want to challenge you to be able to move between different positions and thus move into different sensations of stretch. The increases in mobility don't just come from holding the positions, but demonstrating strength and control in the positions, and then as you transition in and out of those positions. Constantly be asking yourself the question, how stable am I? Now, from more of a external or performance perspective, your stability will be reflected by your ability to remain balanced through the movement. That's tangible, real-time feedback that you can use to start to make adjustments and just gauge how effective and efficient you're being. However, to go into some of the deeper layers, I also want you to start exploring your internal experience. Start to feel what stability feels like from the inside out. For me personally, that feels like a deep sense of being rooted. My points of support, or the areas that are in contact with the ground, bearing body weight, are strongly connected to the ground. There's an appropriate amount of tension flowing through my body, connecting my body. This rooting and this strength is really a felt sense. And when you feel that, you're free to relax certain areas of your body, to rotate through your head and shoulders to be able to scan your environment, or to reach your limbs to interact with the environment. Stability stems from tension and structural alignment. And this frees you up so you're not overly reliant on using your vision or using your limbs to counterbalance. We'll make a transition here into a downward dog position and one of my favorite variants, the single leg downward dog. Feeling the connection in the body and using the strength of the hip to lift the leg, and breathing through the intense stretch that this movement creates. Now, the next little bit of the practice is definitely going to be yoga inspired. And I want to touch on the relationship between yoga and natural movement. Now, for me personally, yoga has been a part of my journey. As you can see, especially here, I'm not some super flexible yogi, but I'm fairly mobile. I've gained a lot from the physical practice of yoga as well as the philosophy. I've come to understand the physical practice of yoga as a natural movement practice. Now, it really serves me to see movement as kind of this universal language. There's different ways of moving, there's different intentions with which to move, and I start to see that we're not exactly served by keeping movements in the box or solely identifying with just one form of movement. And when I look at yoga within the context of our culture, I see that it's become something very performance oriented and something that many people are dogmatic about. We're always trying to put these practices in a box as a way to categorize them or build an identity around them. But at the end of the day, to just see that it's all movement is very liberating. So practice yoga by all means. Gain the physical, mental, emotional, spiritual benefits from the practice, but don't make it your everything. Don't build your entire identity around it. Understand that you're a complete person. You move in a variety of different ways, and to just see your yoga practice is one facet of that. Okay, cool. A little bit of a tangent there, but hopefully that provides you some perspective and just a way to think about the big picture of movement. Getting back into our practice, we're going back and forth between these high lunges and split hinges. Again, this concept of rooting becomes incredibly important. How can you root into the ground in order to create strength and stability in each of these positions? Whether we're talking about downward dog, the high lunge, or the split hinge, all of these positions can be found in a somewhat passive way where you're just kind of there, not really doing much, just hanging out. On the flip side of that, we can create a tremendous amount of intention and activation within the body. This creates an internal environment where muscles are firing and we're able to explore what the optimal alignment of the structure might be. For example, in rising up to the high lunge, the feet are strongly and evenly rooted into the ground. The muscles of the legs, hips, pelvic floor, core are all actively engaged. and we're creating lift and length throughout the spinal column. We'll maintain this with intention as we introduce changes to the position, such as reaching or bowing forward. Again, stay curious and keep observing, because the smallest changes to these positions can completely change the experience. A flexed foot, wiggling the toes, turning the head, rotating the shoulders, changing the alignment of the hips, reaching to your end range. These are examples of these small, subtle movements that inform you on the nuanced ways your body moves and organizes itself. They also educate your nervous system, encouraging it to release stored tension and become more adapted to movement. The science behind all this is interesting, but it's incredibly dense too. I think it's important to have a foundational understanding of these concepts, but ultimately the most important thing is experiencing movement for yourself. I believe that it's being in the experience, observing the experience, and starting to ask interesting questions around the possibilities for the experience. That's where we really start to embody our movement practice. So take the time to explore and enjoy something as simple as these forward fold variations. And if you notice that your body has a lot of resistance here in these positions, then you're going to want to create a modification by changing the environment. Allow your hands to rest on a small stool or an elevated surface. A stack of books would work really well. Keep a slight bend in your knees and keep an anterior tilt of the pelvis, almost like you were trying to lengthen the back line of the body, pulling it up towards the ceiling. Play around with allowing the spine to round and finding that fully flexed forward fold position, and alternating that with an organization of the spine, creating length and more of a L shape. There are many different expressions of the forward fold. What's most important is what we already talked about in terms of creating that internal sense of strength and stability. Again, we'll see this single leg lift pattern. This is an incredibly intense stretch for me personally, and I'm playing around with creating activation in the standing leg, playing around with changing the orientation of the hips, whether they're square or rotating open. And I'm using the muscles around the hip, primarily the lateral hip, to really engage and lift that leg as high as possible. It's a combined effort between my standing leg and my lifting leg and my breathing and my ability to just observe and ride that fine line of effort and not overextending myself. Keeping all these things in mind, you can really see how this mobility work is so beneficial to growing our awareness, and it requires us to tap into that awareness. And you can maybe start to see how it can be a slippery slope, potentially trouble to push too far too fast. So we'll get back into perhaps more familiar natural movement territory by getting into our deep squat variations next. The deep squat can be modified or assisted with the use of a heel lift. A stack of books or a 2x4 underneath the heels will help you access the deep squat. Alternatively, holding on to a fixed object, a pole or a door frame, will also help give your body the support it needs to get into that squat position. Deep hip flexion, deep knee flexion. So some of the variations that I'm choosing to explore in this round, some knee touches, so shifting weight and allowing one knee to kiss the ground. We've got these overhead reaches, so nice for opening up the thoracic spine. And we'll see some squat rotations as well. And I like to think about this as just situational awareness. You're in the squat position, but can you observe what's going on around you? Do you have 360 degrees of visibility? Stay open to what a squat can be. There's a lot of talk in the movement world about the perfect deep squat, and I find this to be really restrictive, very limiting. Shape the environment so you can access the squat position and then play around with movement in the squat. We're going to take it down and work on our sits next, starting with the side bent sit. The activation here for me is primarily coming in the front leg. You can see I've got the front foot flexed, and it's almost like I'm gripping the ground with that front leg. I'm maintaining enough tension in my core to maintain the spinal stability, and I'm leaning forward at the hips. I'll bring the back leg forward and hook it across my front knee for the crossover sit. Again, staying relatively active here, nice long spine, and I want to make sure that the opening is coming from the hip and I'm not feeling excessive tension or pain, sketchiness in the knee. If I unhook the leg, open it out to the side, I've got a half open bent sit. Again, exploring this version of the sit with both a elongated spine, but then also exploring rounding my spine as well. Keeping the breathing deep and being respectful of my body and the range of motion that I've currently got. We'll set this up on the other side and see how it compares. We'll hit the same positions, but they might be slightly different variations, and that's okay. There's always going to be variance. There's always going to be asymmetries. So the opportunity to explore outside of the box, outside of the realm of perfect technique, this is where movement practice yields so much benefit in our lives to start to develop a capacity for adaptability. In this sense, there is no perfect practice, but it's the idea of practicing perfectly. The idea that you're going to stay connected to what you're doing and not just check out. And that's why I create these sessions or set aside time in my practice to focus solely on mobility and creating and fostering the ability to move. So often in our workouts, the mobility part is just a few minutes to warm up before we get into the work, or it's just a few minutes of an afterthought at the end of a tough workout. We value the grind and the hard work and the stress, but the softer stuff, the practices that require more patience and probably more attention, often fall to the wayside. I've been more inclined towards doing and towards effort. I found a lot of balance in returning to these practices that just require me to be patient, to be mindful, and to just accept where I'm at. Wherever you are, whatever you're inclined to do, and however you're inclined to show up, I think there's a lot of value in getting some of the opposite into your life. It's for this reason that these sits are so compelling to me. It's nothing special going on here. We're just looking at sitting on the ground. But if we don't go out of our way to do this, it's something that we don't do. We never have to sit on the ground, but there's so much value here. Ground sitting requires a certain amount of intention and a softer effort. When we're sitting, we're at rest. It shouldn't really be a struggle. But at the same time, when we're in a chair, oftentimes we're just melting into that chair. We're not creating any type of internal activation. We're just passively collapsing into that position. Ground sitting is a task where we're prompted to create internal stability from the stable foundation of the ground. Even though we're at rest, we're adding more movement by changing around to these different positions. All of these positional changes equate to more movement diversity. This equates to more opportunities for our muscles and joints to be exposed to different types of stress, gentle stress that ultimately keeps our body in good condition. The secret here is just being progressive with how you're practicing the simple art of sitting. If you haven't had a seat on the ground, if it's really uncomfortable for you, if you feel really restricted and tight, again, that's the opportunity to change the environment by making sure that you're wearing comfortable clothing, by padding the ground, by adding blankets or bolsters for your hips, or by making sure that you can hold on to a fixed object or an elevated surface for additional support. These are all strategies to make sure that you're meeting your body where you're at currently. With these softer practices, this isn't about struggling through it. It's, again, riding that line of effort and ease. We want you working, but we don't want you dying to get there. Change happens incrementally. The improvement is so small, almost imperceptible on a day-to-day basis. And therein lies the challenge of this softer practice. It's not about how hard you can go for a short amount of time. It's about your consistency. It's all about your patience, and it's all about your trust in the process. You might not be able to see the change every day, but you stay consistent with the practice. And then weeks, months, maybe even years later, you can look back and you can see just how far you've come. The good news is that progress compounds. The more you practice ground sitting, the more familiar it becomes, the more likely you are to sit on the ground more often, which yields more results. It's a positive feedback cycle. Make a transition next here into hands and knees position. We'll work on some spinal articulation. So again, we've got this kind of standardized movement from yoga. You might think of like cat-cow, but what I want you to do here is try to envision your spine. In your mind's eye, see your spinal column deep in your body and really picture it, all the different ways that can articulate. You know, I like to think about a boa constrictor or something like that. If you could see a snake through the x-ray and just envision all the ways that a snake can articulate and think about that, compare that to your own spine. And you're going to try to mirror those movements as you go through these articulation patterns. It's so much more than just the global flexion and extension, but how can you learn to create more control and be more precise with your spinal movements? That's what we're after here with this practice. You begin with smaller movements. I want you to start to get to know the different segments of your spine, the cervical spine, the thoracic spine, and the lumbar spine. We're learning to dissociate these different areas. They play different roles in our movements, and to develop more control and more articulation and more communication between the segments of the spine is a beneficial skill to hone. Greater awareness leads to the ability to explore more complexity in these patterns. So work to try out these spinal waves. Can you create a fluid undulation that runs through the entire length of your spine? You'll notice the patterns where you're really coordinated and the movement is very controlled and skillful. And you'll notice other times, other patterns where the movement is just clunky and unfamiliar. This all irons out in time with mindful practice. There's a saying that goes, "You're as old as your spine," meaning that if your spine is very mobile and you can articulate and move very fluidly through your spine, your ability to move in the world is going to be pretty good. But what happens to most of us is we stop moving in these ways and our spine gets very stiff. We start to lose the neuromuscular control and we get rigid. And this looks a lot like what we call the aging process. Our society kind of sexualizes these articular movements, these serpentine spinal type movements, and they become somewhat taboo. We're kind of taught to not move like this because it's weird. But again, if you can get into this practice in a pretty short amount of time, I'm confident that you'll start feeling so much more mobile, so much more loose and fluid, that you'll enter, again, that positive feedback loop where you'll start making these movements a part of your normal existence for the benefit of your health. And then the tables are turned. It seems crazy not to do these movements just because society labels them one way or another. We're getting into the last part of our practice now, some bridging. We've been mobilizing the spine and the hips pretty well throughout the course of the practice. And if this is something that you feel like you're ready for, we've got some different bridging variations and you can see what's going to work best for you. I'm starting with just lying on the back, rolling side to side. If you can get up into a hip bridge, that's great. And then planting the hands and pushing up into a full bridge requires a really good amount of mobility. There are ways to scale this, whether you use an elevated surface or you use the wall. You just want to be mindful of not chasing these movements, but allowing your body to express them given your current level of mobility. Good range of motion at the shoulders and extension of the thoracic spine are really key for bridging here. And this one isn't worth contorting yourself or forcing yourself into position, but rather checking in, doing the work, and figuring out how you can isolate those tight spots or those trouble spots, those spots that are lacking mobility, and put the pieces together in time. If you're there and you're feeling confident with your bridging, we're going to finish today with some of these bridge rotations. It's almost like we're going from the squat position we saw previously, learning where to plant the hands and starting to rotate into the full bridge. This requires an incredible amount of focus, the right amount of tension and relaxation and coordination. Again, this is not one to force, but rather one to unlock, continuing to work your strength and stability. Even if you're feeling pretty good about this, I would still encourage you to try the wall bridge rotations. Instead of planting your hands on the floor, plant them against the wall and incrementally increase the intensity behind this pattern. And there's just a lot more room to play and different variations that you can use with the wall versus just on the floor. We're really pushing things with this final expression, and we're going to make sure to finish up the practice with just some lighter movements. There's a lot of tension required to stabilize and pull ourselves through the bridge rotation. So just finishing with any softer movements that are going to release some of that tension and just allow your body to relax. For this entire video, we've been talking about building your mobility by using your strength and using your intention to further your stretch and control your joints as you take them through a full range of motion. With continued mobility work, you're going to see natural increases in your flexibility. If you put the work in on your mobility training, one of the benefits of that is just feeling naturally more flexible. And what's even better is if you continue to practice your mobility work, you have all this usable range of motion. You have strength and control, not just the ability to be passively flexible. I hope that provides some clarity around the difference between mobility training and just what we think of as general stretching or passive stretching. And that being said, mobility work is definitely going to give you the most bang for your buck, but there's a place for passive stretching. Anytime you get done with an intense workout, whether it's a strength workout, conditioning workout, or even a mobility workout, finishing off the session with light movements like these is just a really nice way to calm the nervous system and finish up. All right, you guys, that's going to bring us to the end of the practice today. As always, it's a pleasure to move with you, and I'm really glad to be able to share with you some of the subtext around mobility work. It seems like a lot of people are really starting to catch on to the idea that health and fitness is more than just hardcore workouts. It's more than just crushing yourself in the gym, but it's recovery too. And longevity is predicated on your ability to move. And that's why mobility work, mobility training is so important. On the flip side of that, it doesn't need to be taken to extremes. You don't need to have contortionist levels of mobility. I hope you took away a few good movements from today's practice that really serve you, that really hit your sticking points. If so, I'd love to hear about it in the comments section. That's a wrap today, you guys. Thanks for joining in. Move well, be well, and I will see you in the next video.